our work on women and rivers, as well as the South Asia program. I come from a region of the world where there is a massive push for hydropower all over the region, especially in the Himalayan belt. And we're seeing large-scale climate impacts, not in the future, but already. Of great concern to us is that there are a number of countries whose NDCs and climate plans, they rely heavily on developing new hydro and calling for scarce climate dollars or scarce climate finance to support all of this. This panel today will talk through why this is a flawed premise and why hydropower represents a very false climate solution. Indeed, instead of representing a real climate solution, it's the Achilles heel of hydro. We saw very recently in Libya, in a place called Derna, where climate-induced extreme weather combined with aging and neglected infrastructure led to the worst dam disaster in living memory, with over 10,000 people killed. We'll also hear from one of our panelists about a very, very recent dam disaster in Sikkim in India, as early as the 4th of October. So before I introduce our esteemed panel here today, I want us to take a moment just to think about all those lives lost and the increasing number of lives that we will continue to lose if we don't start understanding that hydropower and large hydropower is actually not a real climate solution. So let's just take a few seconds just to think about that before we listen to our panel. All right. So our first panelist is actually joining us virtually. We have Mark Easter. Mark Easter is an ecologist and a lead scientist for the organization Tell the Damn Truth. He spent much of his career as a natural resource ecology at the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at the Colorado State University, working in a research team that developed and implemented greenhouse gas inventory methods for agriculture, forestry, wetlands, and other land uses. He has contributed analyses to multiple IPCC reports and collaborated on greenhouse gas inventories from the farm scale to the country scale on every continent except Antarctica. Mark, can we hear you? Can you? All right, we see you. I will click your slide, so you can just let me know when I need to change your slide. Over to you, Mark. We're not getting any sound from Mark at the moment. Mark, if you can hear us, just hold on. Nope. Mark will be talking to us about hydropower's underestimated methane footprint and developments and need for countries to factor dams' GHG emissions in their NDCs. We're just waiting to hear if we have sound. Are you okay to go? Okay, let me check if I should. Yeah. Wait. Maybe we can actually move to our next speaker while the technical team's figuring out the sound. Is that okay? Yeah? So can you move on to the next presentation? Mark, we'll just figure it out why we can't hear you. In the meantime, I pivot to Mayalmit Lepcha. Mayalmit Lepcha is a leader from the Lepcha indigenous community in Sikkim in India. She is the General Secretary of the Affected Citizens of Teesta and the President of the Sikkim Indigenous Lepcha Tribal Association. She has been working to protect her homeland of Dzongu in Sikkim from the onslaught of megadams in her state. She's been working for over 17 years doing this and works closely with the youth and women in her region and regularly organize events, training, capacity building for Lepcha diaspora, not just in Sikkim, but in Darjeeling and the Kalimpong Hills. Mayal will be speaking to us about her struggle along with her community, and she will talk a little bit about the disaster that happened on October the 4th. Over to you, Mayal.
Okay, Kamrimo. Good evening, everyone. I'm from Sikkim, a tiny Himalayan state in northeast India. We've been declared as a primitive tribe by our state government under the notification 375. The government have also declared under the notification 642 Dzongu Reserve Area as a Lepcha indigenous habitat. Though Dzongu, the place that I come from, was already a reserve area for indigenous people under the notification 3069, which still protect under the Article 371F of the Indian Constitution, which does not allow any outsider to enter and settle in Dzongu. If you want to enter, if you want to come to Dzongu, you need to take a special permit from the district authority.
We need to change the presentation to the second one because this one's still the first presentation happening. I apologize for not spotting that sooner. Okay. Sorry, Maya. You might just have to click through one or two. Yeah, it's a picture. Next one.
What's the first slide? Yeah? No, no. You can click it. No, no, that isn't already.
No, that's the, you've gone too far. Let me.
Okay, this
Sorry
is
about
a
that,
picture of
everyone.
this is a Dzongu. Our indigenous Lepcha land has been protected by the laws called Revenue Order Number 1, which does not allow our land to be bought by non-indigenous community or sell to non-indigenous community in Sikkim. Yet, the government has planned to build more than 30 dams at the various stages of completion. Some are under construction, some are commissioned, some are proposed. We have more than 58 pharmaceutical companies which are built at the banks of River Teesta and River Rangit. These River Teesta and Rangit are the most sacred for the Lepcha community. We have a strong belief that after we die, our soul travels back to Pumzulang, the soul resting place, at the foothills of Mount Kongchenchu, which is called Mount Kanchenjunga, the third highest mountain in the world from these rivers. Our clan creation stories are based on this rich ecology, and first human being has been created from a pure snowball of Mount Kanchenjunga. We don't have a concept of heaven or hell. All our soul goes back to Pumzulang, the soul resting place. Dzongu was the largest producer of large cardamom in the region. It has declined the product recently. We grow best oranges in the region, and the production also has gone down. Our sacred streams, lakes, pond, spring waters, and small rivers are drying up. Decrease in snowfalls, and there is a strange in the weather patterns. People have stopped cultivating paddy because of this reason. Affected citizen of Teesta came down to the capital in the year 2007 and started a relay hunger strike. He relay hunger strike for 915 days. and two of our brothers, Tenzing and Dawa Lepcha, sat for indefinite hunger strike for 66 days in first phase and 96 days in second phase. We shouted slogan in the streets of capital, Gangtok. We were jailed, had to drop regular college. Our struggles lasted for many years and still continuing because of non-violence, the way of protesting. We filed public interest litigations in the High Court of Sikkim in the year 2009 against Stage 3, 1200 megawatts, but unfortunately we lost the case in 2012. We even filed writ petitions in National Green Tribunal. There also we were not given justice. But we could scrap 4 mega power project, which was inside the Kanchenjunga National Park, a declared World Heritage Site in 2016. Recently, we witnessed devastation made by a glacier lake outburst flood on 4th of October 2023, which broke and washed away Stage 3, 1200 megawatts dam, the largest dam in Sikkim. This dam took 12 years to build and washed away in just 10 minutes. It was the indigenous communities who were the most affected and lost their lives, lost their land and property. Government does not have exact data of how many people died and how many were missing. But when these kind of disaster happens, the indigenous community does not even have time to mourn and grieve. They are the ones who are doing immediate rescue operation. NDRF were reaching the most affected area after 1 week. None of the central agencies were visiting the affected area, and even the project developers failed to meet affected people till date. It was the indigenous community who were building bamboo bridges. For immediate transportation, this flood had washed away multiple bridges which connect different places of Sikkim and had even washed away the highways. So these are the pictures that I'm sharing from the place of most affected, that dam got washed away. And if you see this, see this image, if you see from that, there's a 2 river flowing down towards the dam. In 4th of October 1968, a similar glacier lake had been, washed away. And this time, in the other river, we had a massive, flood. And we not only just washed away the Stage 3, but it was downstream. We have Stage 5 of 510 megawatts, Stage 6 in the downstream. Now we could see our river been flowing freely, and I think we should let our river flow freely. Since Teesta River is a transboundary river which flows from Sikkim to West Bengal and Bangladesh, we've been sharing this river for generation and generation. Apart from damage to rivers and native people, loans from different international financial institutions are only breeding corruptions in Sikkim, where we don't have anti-corruption machineries. People are put entirely at the mercies of the powerful lobbies. They are playing games with the lives of the poor indigenous people. It's not about development at all. At the end, I would like to make an earnest plea to you all and the world that such lopsided governmental policies must be deterred. Hydropower projects have caused more untold miseries and displacement of indigenous Lepcha people than any good to the nation or any significant tool in reducing carbon print. The indigenous Lepcha people are faced with danger of displacement from their land, losing their culture and the way of living, so closely interrelated to preserving and protecting the nature environment. They are the last hope of the mankind in saving the mountains and the rivers. Thank you, Achule.
Thank you, Mayal. And from one large dam state to another country, we traverse from South Asia to the continent of Africa, where Emmanuel from CORAP will talk about the proposed Grand Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It would be the largest hydro project in the world, and we're seeing how billionaires plan to convert power into hydrogen for export to Europe for so-called green hydrogen, meanwhile leaving the DRC in the dark. Let me share a little bit about Emmanuel. Emmanuel is an engineer in environment and sanitation management. He has developed an expertise in policy monitoring and advocacy, particularly in the water sector and on renewable energy. He contributed to the creation of several campaigns, among others, on sustainable river management and to fight against large energy infrastructure projects, including the case of the Grand Inga project in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Currently, he plays the role of the executive secretary of the Coalition of Civil Society Organizations for the Monitoring of Reforms and Public Action. Over to you, Emmanuel.
Thank you very much. I greet everybody. As you are saying, we are working hardly against that big project of dam that DRC need to develop. As you can know, Grand Inga is a big potential that DRC have. We can start talking about the potential in hydroelectricity of DRC. As you can see on the picture, DRC have a big, one of the big potential in hydroelectricity. We can say that it has more than 100 megawatts as a potential. On that picture, you can see that it is possible for DRC to build them all part in the country, and through that we have a big potential of Inga, because I was saying that we have the possibility to develop more than 100,000 megawatts as a potential, but only the Inga site, the place where they need to build Inga, we can have the half potential in that global that DRC have as a potential. And the ambition of our government, the DRC government, is to build a large dam, a first large dam in the world. We know that actually it is Chinese who has a big dam in the world, but in that place, DRC government need to build a potential of 45,000 megawatts of electricity. Actually, you can see also in that map that it is this potential is located on the river, Congo rivers. Congo rivers, as you know, it is a second large rivers in the world after Amazonia. It is one of the important resources that the world have today. We are talking about climate change, and that rivers is one of the most important in the Congo basin, as you can see. Actually, this project of Big Inga will be built. They need to build the dam on the rivers. If you can see, they need to build it on the rivers and to get more of that float, to bring it in a small place that's called Bundi Valley, and they need to produce that electricity. Initially, Inga project was planned to be built in a phase, starting by Inga 3 to Inga 8 in 6 phases, because we have actually Inga 1 and Inga 2 who is built since 1982. That two Inga exist, but you can imagine the two dams that we have, Inga 1 and 2, was bring a lot of impact in the community area. Today, as I told you, there are one community that's called Makuku Futila, who was lost completely their land. They are living in the land of other community, and we can say that they have lost their identity because of that. If we can talk about other impacts today in DRC, this big dam was bring debt, and through that there was cancel some social expense, like some expense that was programmed for the student to get the bus and so on. they don't exist today because of that dam. And we can also see the impact in environmental issues. In the past, this place was keep more than 55 species of fish. But because of that dam was built, we can see today we don't have more than 15 species of fish in that place. We can imagine more than 60% of people in DRC is in the rural areas. And when we are in the rural areas, the activity is around water, around the ground, but nothing is happened again in that place, and we can imagine that community is become again very poor, and there are a lot of impact. This is the situation. We have these two dams, but they need to build a big one, maybe in phase, but to become a big in the world. And we can also imagine all impact that this dam can bring in the community, locally and national level. That project for production of more than 55,000 megawatts, I was saying that it is a very big project and it will bring a lot of impact. Maybe today, around the Inga place, there are directly 9 villages. If this dam is built, these 9 villages will be displaced. We are saying that more than 40,000 people can lose their land, and it will become a very big problem. We can also imagine that the big dam will, the flow risk is higher, is very higher. A lot of village will be in the water because of the construction of that dam, and it will bring a lot of risk. But something to know about green hydrogen. Actually, one company is called, one Australian company who is calling Fortescue Future Industries, needs to take the concession contract with DRC. They need to build that dam. Why they need to build it? Because they are a vision to become a strong or a first companies in the world who are developing the green hydrogen. And they need to take all of that potential to produce green hydrogen, and strategically they need to take it and sell it in Europe, maybe German and European Union. They will build everything, and without to give any electricity to Congolese people. But you can see also that DRC actually is one of the last country who have a good access to electricity. Less than 10% of people have access to electricity. That is why we can't imagine to develop one project who will take all energy and bring it outside, because at the same time people will still in the poverty of electricity, will still in the lack of electricity without all of other impact that the dam will bring. That is why we are asking today some question to say that green hydrogen may not be a bad thing, maybe, but produced by which project? Because the Inga project is a big dam, and big dam will bring a lot of impact. Through that, we can still call that project as a green hydrogen or not. Another question that we are asking is, it is the one producer by project that will create major impact, as I was coming, and why to produce electricity in one country who don't have electricity and get all of that potential for selling in Europe, in US and so on. We see that it can be another kind of colonialization. That is why we are not agree with that project, and we still making the advocacy to see the right of people be respected. Thank you.
Thank you Thank you, Emmanuel. I think that shocked me. Just hearing those numbers, 50,000 megawatts, that's no joke. Mayal talked about a 1,200 megawatt dam burst. I don't know what a dam burst would look like in a 55,000 megawatt dam. All right, so over to our next speaker. We have Chris Wilkie, hailing from the Salish Sea region of the northwest coast in the United States of America. Chris has a passion for the environment and all things aquatic. As a global advocacy manager for the Waterkeepers Alliance, he handles free-flowing rivers, climate, and plastics advocacy topics, with much work outside of the US. Prior to joining staff at Waterkeepers Alliance, Chris was the executive director at the Puget Sound and the Puget Soundkeeper in Seattle, where he led the organization's advocacy on water pollution issues and served on several boards for local, regional, and global water protection efforts. Chris will explore how 3 rivers are impacted at different stages of development and how this is inconsistent with efforts to limit loss and damage. We're hearing those words a lot at the COP these days, so let's hear what Chris has to say. Over to you.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you, and thank you to the presenters that have gone before me. What I've learned here today, which I already understood, is that dams actually contribute to loss and damage, and we'll also explore soon how dams actually contribute to climate change. So I am a Global Advocacy Manager with Waterkeeper Alliance, and I work with our network of 300 waterkeepers around the world on different advocacy projects, primarily free-flowing rivers, fossil fuels, and plastics. So just a few simple tasks to solve. This is me here in the air over some of our dairy lands in Washington, exploring pollution sources from the air. My home territory is on Coast Salish territory. This is not an exact designation of that territory, but it is a continuously habited area where the native peoples that lived there before European contact really did live in harmony with the landscape, and we'll be exploring some of the uses of the waterways. The other thing to understand about this area is it is salmon country. How many people here have ever had a bite of salmon for seafood? Okay, this is, our rivers are defined by salmon. We actually have 8 different species of salmonids, and they are all born in freshwater. They rear for a certain amount of time in freshwater. They require cold, clean water. And then, as if by magic, they turn around and go out to sea for 1 to 7 years, depending on the species, migrating as far as Siberia, and coming back right on schedule with all of their kin to spawn in the gravel of the same river where they were born. And in fact, if salmon were a corporation, they would have a strategic plan to actually support their habitat. So when they leave their rivers, they're about this big. When they come back, they're about this big, about 2 meters, and up to 2 meters. And they nourish the land. They die in the rivers where they were born, and that energy coming from the sea, those nutrients, go on to support the forests and the entire landscape of the Pacific Northwest. And so this is the salmon life cycle, born from eggs in the bottom of the picture, moving towards an alevin, which is the fry that hatch out of the eggs, onto the fry stage, soon becoming smolts in anywhere from a matter of weeks to a couple years, going to sea, becoming large, and then in the last couple months of their life, they go through a rapid transformation to what you see in the lower right of your screen. They stop feeding entirely, where they spawn and die and nourish the river. Salmon are a critical first food for Northwest tribes in our region. And I'm cognizant of, we actually had a speaker today, Thomas Joseph from the Indigenous Environmental Network, who was unable to make it. So I will do my best to represent their views. But it's very critical to recognize that in the United States in particular, the Northwest tribes have treaty rights for fishing, for ceremonial purposes, subsistence rights, as well as commercial fishing. And some members of these tribes have told me personally that this is one of the most important aspects of their culture, is to maintain access to the first foods. We're losing our salmon. This is a relatively old graph, but it shows the decline. Some of our rivers are down to 1% of their historical salmon runs. So I'm going to talk about 3 rivers here very, very briefly to try and get through this. But the first one I want to start with is the Columbia River. Could there be a better name, a more colonial name for a river than the Columbia River? It is one of the most powerful rivers in the world, and it is perhaps the greatest, historically the greatest salmon river on Earth. All 8 species of salmonids live in this watershed, and some of them migrate up the Snake River 1,000 river miles from the ocean to spawn at an altitude of 2,000 meters, up whitewater and a number of obstacles. And we're also the historic epicenter for hydropower development. This is the Grand Coulee Dam, over 6,000 megawatts. There was no fish passage built with this dam. So above it, the salmon passage was blocked. There was a historic decision. It was illegal to block salmon passage when they built these dams, but there was a historic decision to build hatcheries instead of allowing fish passage. So that was the solution that was offered. And it kind of worked for a couple decades, but the hatcheries are these factories where artificially produced fish. They grow less and less able to make the spawning journey year after year, and so the numbers are in steep decline even for the hatchery fish. And there you can see the dams that are built on the Columbia River. It's been transformed. One of the most powerful rivers on Earth has been transformed into a series of lakes. You can now take an ocean-going barge up to Idaho to move grain out to the Pacific instead of using the rail lines that are already built. And in fact, some of the dams are actually built for navigation as much as they are for hydroelectric. And there you can see these dams, where they're going, and the types of outputs that they have. Here's one of the consequences. This is an area, a sacred site called Celilo Falls on the Columbia River. It's now a lake. This is underwater. This was the largest continuously inhabited settlement, village in North America that we know of. And it was a trading center. It's been called by Westerners as the Wall Street of Native culture, but in reality, Wall Street's only been around for what, 100, 150 years? This would be more like the Rome, the London, the Paris, and the New York, all put together, and still does not constitute the length of time that the cultures centered around this. And this was the fishing center for salmon. The salmon slowed down as they ascended those falls. They made it up over those falls, the fish, so that kept the fish really strong. Just backing up, so historically 10 to 16 million fish ascended the Columbia River, and that dam went in 1957, and so that site has not existed since. On the Mekong River, we're going to move along. This is a river under rapid development, and you can see the red squares are the dams that have already been put in, and the yellow squares are the dams that are currently in development, and the blue ones at the very bottom are the dams that are proposed. And this is forever altering the flows of the Mekong River, where 6 to 18% of the global freshwater fish catch comes from. It represents food security for 60 million people. 81% of the protein intake for the country of Cambodia is from fish, and 48% from Laos. And also very important to realize that the headwaters of the Mekong River are in the Himalayas, and so there's a huge sediment flow all the way to the Mekong Delta. And the disruption of that sediment flow destroys the river habitat and also the delta, where it's basically the rice basket for the region, and they're losing land in Vietnam that is very productive for the production of rice and other agricultural products. There's one of our heroes of the Mekong who has been working to save it, Kru T, and he operates a school on the Mekong. They're dealing with this development as it takes place, so they're showing people how to take care of the water even as this region is being developed for hydropower. Next, we'll go on to the Karnali River in western Nepal. This is the last free-flowing river in Nepal, and it's under development. You can see in the lower map there the horseshoe bend of the river. This is called a run-of-river dam that is proposed there. They're going to drill a hole, a tunnel, through the short part of that bend and dewater 48 kilometers of this river. And they call it a run-of-the-river dam, but the river will be dry for eight months out of the year. So obviously block fish passage, obviously block sediment flow that goes all the way to the confluence with the Ganges. And there are cultures there that rely heavily on the river, the Bengal tigers, the golden mahseer fish, which has been called the tiger of the river, and it also has potential for sustainable ecotourism. So we have a Save the Karnali campaign. You can sign the petition to block the Karnali River Dam, savethekarnali.net. The last thing I just wanted to mention here, it's going to be covered more by our Conrad Fisher, one of our last speakers, but dams are really a false solution to climate change. There are massive methane emissions that can occur behind dams, and it really causes a loss of climate resilience. So the ability of these rivers to provide for people is going to be lost. So once again, a call to action. You can go to undam.org and tell the UN to eliminate dams as carbon credits. 25% of all clean development mechanism carbon credits are for hydropower projects. So once again, it's undam.org, and you can go and sign the petition there. So that's what I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And I'm glad you brought in a biodiversity angle. Very often, we get stuck talking about human lives and human rights, and we completely forget that we share our planet, with other species and other beings, and they have rights too, and their rights need to be respected as well. Thank you also for taking us around the world. You took us to different continents, including, Asia. You talked about the Mekong River, and you talked about Northern America and other places. So thank you for that. We're now going to pivot, hopefully, to our virtual speakers who will hopefully have sound now. So we're going to go to Conrad Fisher, who is the director of the Water Climate Trust, based in California and Oregon. His work focuses on preventing and removing harmful dams and enforcing laws to keep enough water in the rivers for ecosystems and river-dependent communities. He's part of the movement to undam the Klamath River, which he will speak to, and will also speak on hydropower offsets and counterfeit carbon trading amongst UN member countries. Over to you, Conrad. Let's hear if you have sound.
Hi, thank you. How's the audio?
Too much sound
Mark.
now. First no sound, now too much sound. All right. Can you try that again?
Hi, everyone. How's the audio?
Yeah, better. Great.
Great. And I can't see the slides, but I'll begin. Maybe hopefully the slides can come up. My name is Conrad Fisher, and my home is on the Klamath River in Northern California and Southern Oregon. My colleague there's echo. So I'll keep going. So this is a little bit of the story of what has become the largest dam removal in world history. And I think there are some lessons for other countries, and other countries, of course, face very other unique circumstances that do not apply. But starting in 2001, the George Bush administration, this was his boss, this is Vice President Cheney, basically intervened and told federal scientists not to tell the truth about essentially how much water fish need and the fact that dams combined with low flows were going to kill salmon. So the people in control of the water listened to this guy rather than the scientists. Next slide, please. And this was the result. This is the at least regionally famous Klamath River fish kill of 2002, when tens of thousands salmon died. I was there when this happened. There were a lot of indigenous people and others praying in the streets. This was very hard. But the silver lining was that it united groups like never before to focus, instead of fighting over who gets how much salmon, focusing on how to make more salmon. So that was, I would say, what started the movement to undam Klamath in a way. Next slide, please. So from the fish kill in 2002 until 2010, there were massive protests focusing on the owner of the dams. At one point, the owner was Scottish Power. So I don't know if any of you saw the news. There were indigenous people from California and Oregon that went to tell the owner, you are literally starving indigenous tribes and choking a river. Scottish Power then immediately sold it to Warren Buffett's company, Berkshire Hathaway. So then the protests moved to annual meetings of Warren Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway. And at the end of the day, next slide, please, as a result of a lot of direct action and litigation, there was an agreement to undam the Klamath. And this is California's governor signing it, and he actually did say this. Hasta la vista to the dams. This agreement in 2010 included what I consider a not favorable water agreement attached to the dam agreement. And it included waivers of claim to tribal water rights attached to it, meaning in this case, tribes in this area have a right not to a specific amount of water. It hasn't been quantified, but it is tied to an outcome, and that outcome for tribal trust obligations is essentially enough water in the river for fish to eat. So next slide, please. From 2010 until 2016, the movement was mostly focused on getting the United States Congress to approve that 2010 deal. At the end of the day, the Republicans in Congress shot themselves in the foot because they did not want to be part of removing dams. But in the process, they threw out what was a very sweetheart water deal for themselves and their constituents. So the movement finally, myself included, gave up on getting Congress to approve dam removal. And fortunately, in 2016, there was a new deal to have the dams removed without an unfavorable water agreement. So this new agreement is now being implemented. Next slide, please. Without an unfortunate water agreement, we are getting these 4 dams off of the Klamath River this year. So the one in the upper right is gone already. The remainder will be taken out early next year. So this will be the largest dam removal in history. It will give salmon and steelhead a lot more habitat. We still have not resolved who gets how much water, but next slide, please. This will definitely make the river cleaner. So this is the dam above where I live. I live on the Klamath, and the water looks this green in late summer. So because the water festers behind the dams and grows toxic algae, it has been a major pollution issue, and this will go away. The river will be much cleaner. So you're all invited to come float the Klamath maybe in about 2 years when the river is cleaner and flushed. But to me, the lessons for people working around the world, it's definitely not the same. But in the US, we do have certain laws. So if you're in a country that has laws that say things like endangered species have a right to exist and cannot go extinct, and if you are causing extinction, you may need to do certain things, that's something to consider. If there's laws against pollution, like what you see here, that's also something to consider. So at the end of the day, the reason these dams are coming out is because through lawsuits combined with protests and public relations, we were able to compel the owners, you cannot relicense these dams, which are relicensed every 50 years, unless you comply with these key laws. The Endangered Species Act would have forced the owners of the dams to build fish ladders, which would have been expensive, and compliance with the Clean Water Act would have forced them to somehow not cause this toxic algae. So there was kind of an engineering solution for the fish passage, but there was no engineering solution to eliminate this toxic algae. So the combination of those laws and the expense, our willingness to file lawsuits to enforce those laws, and then the amazing movement of tribes, commercial fisher folk, and enviros together drawing attention to it made it impossible for the owner of the dams to keep them, so they agreed to remove them. So I'm hopeful that this is an inspiration for the rest of the world and will help movements compel their governments to stop building horrible dams, and to see that, at least in the case of the Klamath, third largest river that enters the Pacific in the United States, the river will provide more money without these dams. There will be more tourism than there was before. The water will be cleaner. So just in economic terms, things are better. But also there is a movement definitely in California and the US for politicians to at least pay lip service to helping tribes and tribal communities. So this is one example of them walking their talk. Next slide, please. So very briefly at closing, what can we do about this at the United Nations level? Now that the Klamath dams are coming out, I've looked a lot at what is going on globally. Yes, international financial institutions and the different funders are a definite target and a definite problem, but also there, I think, is some leverage at the United Nations. These are the latest numbers of projects registered by the United Nations to allow either offsets or contributions to nations' nationally determined contributions. So more than 2,000 hydro projects now, according to the latest numbers, account for 18% of all the projects that are registered as offsets, and these account for 22% of all emission reductions that are eligible. So this just shows that dams are being used basically as offsets to allow increased emissions elsewhere. And there have been many studies showing dams are not additional. Additional is the term the United Nations uses to mean that a project actually contributes to, if not reducing emissions, to reducing how fast emissions go up. So when we are approving these dams and allowing 1/5 of all carbon offsets within Article 6 of the Paris Agreement to come from dams that are not additional in many cases, they're basically allowing increased emissions elsewhere in the world, because people buy these credits, countries buy these credits to claim that they're achieving their goals, rather than actually reducing emissions. So Mark will talk about other aspects of methane emissions from dams and arguments we can use in the climate movement. So next slide. So just reiterating what my colleague Chris said, please have a look at this petition, and this is my info if anyone has any further questions, and I'll pass it over to Mark. Thank you. Thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you, Conrad. Both Conrad and Mark are in the US right now, so it's about the middle of the night for them. I think it's about 2 a.m. or something like that. So thank you to both of them for kind of staying up and sharing with us. While I introduce Mark, can someone tee up the presentation? Thank you. All right, I know I introduced Mark earlier, but I want to introduce him again, just for the people who weren't in the room earlier. Mark is an ecologist and a lead scientist for the organization Tell the Damn Truth. He spent much of his career at the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at the Colorado State University, working in a research team that developed and implemented greenhouse gas inventory methods for agriculture, forestry, wetlands, and other land uses. He has contributed analyses to multiple IPCC reports and collaborated on greenhouse gas inventories from the farm scale to the country scale on every continent in the world except Antarctica. Mark will talk about the massive GHG footprint that dams have, in particular methane, and how the impact of dams on climate has been systematically underestimated, and in many cases absent from countries' calculations and climate plans altogether. We've heard stories now from our panelists around the world. It's time to also look at the science. The science is important. These facts are important. So over to Mark to give us some understanding behind this.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here, and I'm honored and humbled to share the platform with these other presenters. Could I have the next slide, please? So I've got 3 take-home messages that I want to impress upon you here. The first is that most reservoirs are giant methane factories, but the methane emissions are only part of the story. The second is that cradle-to-grave life cycle emission inventories are necessary. The same sorts of analysis that we use to estimate the greenhouse gas emissions from all other energy sources, including fossil fuels. These are necessary to account for the full climate impact of hydropower. And then finally, when we examine hydropower through the lens of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, hydropower systems are comparable to fossil fuel-based energy systems. Next slide, please. So I put together this slide to give you a sense of what the emissions can be from reservoirs, what they are globally. On the right-hand side, you see the total emissions from reservoir surfaces, about 2 billion metric tons of CO2 equivalents per year. And that is comparable to the total emissions worldwide from heating and cooling buildings, which is a total of 6% of the global human-caused emissions in the world today. This is really a big deal. And you might ask, well, how can reservoirs produce, how do they produce methane? Why are they giant methane factories? Well, the same sorts of biological and chemical processes that produce methane, where methane are produced in the guts of cattle or in rice paddies, are the same processes that produce methane in reservoirs. When organic matter is washed in from watersheds, when algae are photosynthesized and essentially fix carbon from the atmosphere into reservoir surfaces, then die in their life cycle and sink to the bottom. And then also from carbon that was in forests and grasslands and shrublands and soils in the area where dams are put in and are inundated. The combination of those organic matter inputs are essentially food for microbes in the depths of these reservoirs. In the deepest depths of the reservoirs, there's very little oxygen. And the microbes in that region essentially feed on this organic matter the same way they would in an oxygen-rich environment, but there's no oxygen there. They produce methane as a waste product rather than carbon dioxide through that process. And that methane makes its way to the surface and is emitted. Okay, next slide, please. So again, to this point of cradle-to-grave life cycle analysis as something that's necessary to fully account for hydropower emissions. Just as we look at cradle-to-grave life cycle emissions from coal, from natural gas, from nuclear, solar, wind, geothermal, we need to do the same for hydropower. Now, what do I mean from cradle to grave? We need to look at the emissions associated with dam construction and when reservoirs are inundated, combine that with the emissions through the life of a reservoir. It's typically up to 100 years, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter, but over this entire period, and then also examine what the emissions are associated with decommissioning dams, which is inevitable in the case of every dam. This life cycle approach is consistent with greenhouse gas accounting methods for these other forms of energy, and it's embraced by both the IPCC, the International Energy Agency, and other important bodies that are examining this issue. Next slide, please. Methane emissions are the biggest piece, and I've got a slide to illustrate some of this, but there are other emissions that contribute. And there's three primary greenhouse gases that are involved. There's methane, there's carbon dioxide, and there's also nitrous oxide. At the point of dam construction and inundation at the start of a reservoir and hydropower project, there's carbon dioxide that's produced from constructing the dam, from mining, from burning fossil fuels or other fuels in equipment, and then also from manufacturing cement. And then through the life cycle of the reservoir for up to 100 years, sometimes longer, sometimes less, there's massive methane emissions that come from the surface, and also what's called degassing through turbines. The hydropower turbines that are installed in the dam or near the dam that are run by essentially water pressure coming from the reservoir behind the dam. They typically draw the water to drive the turbines from the lowest depths of the dams. Now, as I mentioned before, those lowest depths of the dams are typically, there's no oxygen or very little oxygen there, and that is where the methane is produced. It's the most methane-rich portion of the dam. And as the water is drawn from that region through the turbines, they're essentially shunting methane from the dam through the turbines and then straight into the atmosphere as the water runs downstream. There's also carbon dioxide that's produced from land use change, carbon leakage, and lost carbon sequestration. Land use change basically means the carbon that is in the forests, the soils, the grasslands at the time the reservoir is inundated becomes food for the microbes. And what doesn't become methane becomes carbon dioxide. Carbon leakage is a really important issue when we talk about indigenous communities that are forced to leave the land when dams are flooded. They have to essentially replace their livelihood. They have to rebuild homes elsewhere. If they're farmers, there tends to be relatively little opportunity to acquire other farmland or grasslands for grazing livestock. So forests get cleared, grasslands get plowed in order to create the farmland or the grazing land that's needed to sustain their livelihoods. That leads to additional carbon emissions. And then finally, there's carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide from wetlands and forest losses downstream, and that's related to the flow regime. The river has no opportunity to continue to flood and maintain wetlands and forests downstream, so those forests and wetlands dry up and die, and we see decomposition and emissions from there. And then finally, at the time of decommissioning, we see what's described in the scientific literature as a hot moment for methane. Methane is produced when sediment is exposed as the reservoir is drawn down, and from sediment erosion. There's also carbon dioxide from deconstruction of the dam. Next slide, please. And this diagram is what we use to illustrate what those different emissions are. And I won't spend a lot of time on this. We can come back to this in the question and answer if there's a need. But this is just to show that there are emissions from these reservoir systems practically everywhere that ecologists and engineers look in these systems. Next slide, please. All right, what I want to do is show you the results of a modeling exercise that we completed for a dam that's proposed in Europe. It's the proposed Skavica Dam on the Black Tern River in Albania. If built, it would be one of the largest hydropower projects and one of the largest reservoirs in Europe. We completed this exercise through a modeling platform that we've built called the All-Res modeling tool. And you can see what I've shown here is the total emissions associated with those different, what we call the source categories that I described on the previous slide. Starting from the left, looking at construction, going through surface emissions, turbine emissions, from land use change, carbon leakage, from operations, and then through the process of decommissioning. When you add this all up for this one project, we're looking at an additional 600,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year going into the atmosphere at a time when we need to be drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, not adding more to the atmosphere. Next slide, please. When we add this all up, and this is a comparison against total greenhouse gas emissions from different sectors, this analysis was done by the National Renewable Energy Lab here in the United States, and it's comparable to the carbon footprint of the different energy sources that are described by the IPCC. We find that natural gas and coal are the largest of the existing sources in this region. However, if the Skavica Dam were built, the emissions from that hydropower project would be comparable to natural gas and coal, and significantly greater than all the other low and lower carbon energy sources. Now, this is just one example, but we find similar results from projects around the world, and in particular in the tropics and where reservoirs are highly eutrophic, like we saw on the Klamath and other systems around the world. Excuse me. The more polluted the reservoirs are, the more methane emissions we're likely to see from them. The greater surface area, the largest area that is inundated in order to produce the reservoir and generate the power to run through the turbines, the more methane emissions we would see from these systems. So next slide, please. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but one of the things that's really lacking right now is there needs to be additional research in order to help quantify, in order to reduce the risk around these systems. We need measurements of turbine degassing. We need additional decommissioning studies to confirm and replicate existing findings about what is described as that hot moment of methane emissions when reservoirs are decommissioned. There's a lot of work right now being done to add additional space-based and airborne methane sensors in order to help understand where emissions are around the world. The Methane Sat platform, the mission that is supposed to be launched here in a few months, has the potential to be useful to help us see methane emissions from reservoirs, but there's a number of other new ones that are being designed, and they need to be designed in order to be able to detect and quantify reservoir emissions. And finally, we need to look at the downstream impacts on wetlands and riparian forests. There have been some analyses, and the issues have been identified but have not been quantified as well as they need to be. All right, last slide, please. So I just want to reiterate these take-home messages. Most reservoirs are giant methane factories, but methane emissions are only part of the story. And we must analyze the emissions from hydropower using life cycle emissions, just like we do from every other energy source. And when we do that, what we see is that life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from hydropower are comparable to fossil fuel-based energy systems. Thank you very much, and I'll hand things back to you, Ayesha.
Wow, thank you, Mark, for all of that fantastic information. I know I've learned quite a bit through that presentation. And so now we're going to shift gears to the audience, because I'm sure many of you have questions for our panelists. How we're going to do it, we're well in time. We've got about 20 minutes to have a good question and answer session. So we're going to take the questions first, if that's okay for our panelists, and then what we'll do is we'll have each one of them answer a section of the questions and kind of give their final remarks, and then we will close out our event. All right, so Bonnie has the mic. Just raise your hands if you have questions. So I see 3 right now, 4, all right. Can you introduce yourself as well so that the panelists know who they're responding to?
Yeah, thanks. My name is Neeraj Antapulia and I'm from Nepal. Very happy to hear about the Karnali, Save the Karnali kind of reference here. Wanted to also kind of share about the people's concern around the transmission lines. You know, when you have the hydroelectricity project and dams, you also have to have the transmission lines, which will then take up people's lands, vast swaths of land, which is agricultural, which is a means of livelihood to them, and displacement and forced eviction. I think one of the questions that we need to be mindful of the human rights concerns when we talk about this is about the indigenous people, but also the people's right to housing, access to land, and all that. Just kind of comment there, not a question. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. And well noted, transmission lines are definitely part of things we need to look at.
Hi there, thank you for the panel. My name is Adil Trehan. I work at a nonprofit that focuses on loss and damage. So it was interesting to hear about the connections between hydropower and loss and damage. My question is, what is like the vision for what should happen to hydropower? Like, we should stop building new ones, we should like deconstruct existing ones. I'm curious, like, are there some geographies where a lot of the community around hydro says that it should continue, or is it kind of like the consensus is across the board that we should stop building new ones, we should remove most of the existing ones? Thank you.
Thank you for that question.
Hi, I'm Atle Harby from SINTEF Norway. It's an independent research institute. I've been working on environmental impacts of hydropower for 30 years, also including greenhouse gas emissions. And I fully agree that there are some dams that are terrible, they are preventing fish, they are emitting methane, but you cannot generalize it like that at all. There are also very many good dams and there are very many bad dams. And we have to concentrate on getting them the right way, I think, because we need them. In the future, we're gonna have only renewable energy, wind and solar. They also have impacts, both greenhouse gas emissions and they take up land. We have to find the right location for them. And the same thing for hydropower, which is the only renewable that actually can be flexible and can give us some energy when the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing. So I also fully understand those examples we've seen here. Those are bad examples. We're not taking care of the local community, using the energy for hydrogen instead of local people, like you said, from the Graninga and so on. And these are just bad developments. So I think we should concentrate on getting all those developments that are necessary, good, and remove those that are bad. And I'm quite sure that is possible, and we unfortunately need, I think the predictions of hydropower is it has to double if we're gonna meet net zero, according to IEA, according to IPCC and so on. So just, I hope we can have a conversation on this, that we have to find the good ones and use them and get rid of the bad ones. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd be very curious to hear the answers to where these good dams are. I haven't seen them yet.
Hello, my name is Arisa Coombs. I'm a researcher at Stanford University, and this is a clarification question to the Tell the Damn Truth life cycle assessment. Members of my research group do methane transformation, considering the impacts of the increased warming potential that methane has as compared to CO2, and I was just curious if the life cycle assessment included that increased warming potential.
Yeah, hi, my name is Brent Milliken. Working with an organization called Conectus Human Rights in Brazil. My question, sort of taking us back to the convention here and incentives that have been created, how do you see the evolution of discussions within the convention about incentives for hydropower? Because even if one is based on the assumption that not all dams are complete disaster, but certainly many of them are very problematic in terms of methane emissions, CO2, nitrous oxide emissions, the whole issue of climate resiliency now with increasing drought and flooding, as we saw in the case of Nepal, not to mention the issues of biodiversity and violations of human rights. So to sort of give a blanket support seems really problematic, going from Kyoto and now with the A6 and the NDC recognitions, and now looking forward where there's you're talking about tripling renewables, ramping up renewables in the next 7 years to 2030, tripling. What do you see as the risks, and also is there any sort of light at the end of the tunnel in terms of more serious criteria on how this issue is being addressed to avoid where hydropower has become a false solution, including that the implications of that for our carbon budgets? Because if we're sort of assuming that they're being positive in terms of net emissions, but in fact they're negative, that's going to have an impact on, so give us an illusion that we're in a better situation than we really are with our carbon budget. So if you could comment on that, thanks.
Last question.
Hi, thank you very much to all of the panelists. I'm Tanya Roberts-Davis. I'm with the NGO Forum on ADB, and I have a few questions. One for Mayal, and I was really interested in hearing, a bit more about now an update of what has happened to the communities that were affected by the dam collapse, and whether, for instance, we've seen in some other cases where communities have got together and with NGOs and with legal groups and have called for reparations or for redress and remedy. So I'm just wondering if there's kind of people are starting to organize for that, and if you could speak a bit about what's going on the ground to get to have some kind of support for the cleanup and for redress and remedy. Secondly, just to Chris, I had a question about the and I mean actually to all the panelists perhaps, the UN, the UN sort of campaign similar to what Brent was saying, and I'm just wondering if you sort of see that in the next couple of years we could really push forward on this call and sort of how we can mobilize around this call, because I think it's going to become even more and more prevalent, especially with whether it's the just energy transition partnerships that we're seeing moving forward or other types of just energy transition schemes that clearly still demarcate hydropower as a potential priority, as a so-called renewable energy, which we all know is a false solution. So just putting that forward, wondering sort of your thoughts around mobilizing further and building that movement. And lastly, for the last presentation, I'm really fascinated by the All-Res tool, and I'm curious, I feel like the World Bank and the other IFIs like the Asian Development Bank use for greenhouse gas emissions, they continuously use what's called the G tool, which is pushed forward by the International Hydropower Association, so by the interests of the hydropower industry. And so the All-Res becomes an alternative. And what I wonder, like in a seriously critical alternative, that I think then I'd be interested in knowing your thoughts on how we actually use leverage this and can start to say that the banks need to be using this tool instead, and if it actually is a possibility that we could be calling for them to be modeling using that tool per se. Thank you.
Okay, so I thought we had a lot of time, but the questions have now taken away half our time. But how we're going to do this is I'll go in the same order that we all spoke. Mark, I would suggest you take the questions that were directly addressed to you, Mayal too, and the rest. And Chris, I think there was a question for you, but the rest could maybe answer some of the other questions around the vision for what should happen to hydropower and some of the others. So I don't want to say anything more. Over to Mayal for her comments and answers to Tanya's question. What's happening on the ground right now?
Right now, before I came to this meet, I was when the this flood happened. After that, I was in different state where I was attending another Northeast water talk. So when I heard this, I would really feel bad because all our indigenous community was really feeling bad because we have warned the government, and we've been warning the government for not a few days. It's been we've been fighting against these dams and warning the government for almost more than 20 years, you know. So, and right now, the most affected area is an indigenous land area called Chungthang, where the stage 3 dams was built. So people are mentally traumatized. They're feeling helpless. I think, and we feel very bad because till right now, none of these developers have visited the affected people, and even this government have just distributed very less amount for as a compensation, you know. So after going back, I've already planned to take some few legal experts to, you know, to work on how to file a PIL in Green Tribunal. This is what we are planning after I go back from here. So this is what I'm planning. And but
Thank you, Mayal. Emmanuel, do you want to answer some?
I think there was some comments, but just to say something around the discussion on hydroelectricity, as you are saying, I was showing that DRC has a lot of potential, but we don't have access to electricity. It is a very big problem, and we are saying no to the dam. It can be seen as a contradiction, but no. Also, we are thinking about the alternative. We are saying no to the big dam because effectively that big dam will bring a lot of change in the community life, a lot of impact, but you can see about other alternative. Actually, we have one example in DRC around the Virunga Park in the north, Kivu North, in one part of DRC. There, they have built a small dam, a decentralized dam. That dam, I can't count the number of people. They are not people who are displaced. That dam has a lot of impact in environmental, and it depends about the technology that you use. That is why, in our side, we are saying big dam is not good, but we can see the technology and the small dam that we can develop around the country that can bring electricity and that can help people to live out of fossil fuel or to continue to use the charcoal or other sources which is not good. For us, it is possible to think about the good things and bad things around that dam, but we have to consider that if the big one, it is not important because we need to produce for sale. And around, we have a bad governance. I think it can bring more problem than it can bring solution. That is why the alternative is important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, actually, I think I can address a couple of the questions here. I'll start with the one that was directly to me about the undam.org campaign and what it is we're looking for. We are actually looking to get these counterfeit carbon credits out of the nationally determined contributions. They should not qualify under that, especially considering the methane emissions. We submitted a declaration to the UNFCCC at COP26 in Glasgow. We followed up with a petition every year where people can sign. It's still active, so that's an ongoing effort. Regarding the comment on the transmission lines, it's a very good point. We should have mentioned it. There's a lot of land that is lost. There's a lot of sequestration of forest that is lost to build transmission lines. In the case of the Upper Karnali River Hydropower project, the chief recipient of that power was going to be Bangladesh. It wasn't even needed in Nepal. And that project is in western Nepal. Bangladesh is, of course, adjacent to eastern Nepal, so the transmission lines have to go the entire length of the country and then some. There's massive losses of the electrical current over that distance as well as the resources and land that's taken. And then finally, this question of good dams and bad dams, I would just like to say, who decides? Who decides what's a good dam and what's a bad dam? Would it not be the people from the region that are utilizing the river sustainably, particularly indigenous populations that are protected globally under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, otherwise known as UNDRIP, and the concept of free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. There's actually a blurb on a association website. Does FPIC amount to a veto power? And the opinion was no. How can it be consent if when you withhold consent, you get to go build the dam anyway? That's not consent. That's the maybe free, prior, and informed if you're lucky, but consent includes saying yes. So coming back to who decides, most of these dams are a dangerous distraction and are actually a false solution to climate change. And I would love to hear if there is a particular one that might qualify that would not be so harmful. There just needs to be a robust decision around that. In terms of what we're looking for, we want to stop the building of new dams. We want to remove them where possible, and then where we can't, mitigate the impacts as best we can. Thank you.
Conrad? Oh, hold on, we're waiting for some sound.
Movement. So first, the world's last wild rivers are precious in and of themselves. They have an intrinsic value, and I think people from Western countries, we should defer to indigenous cultures and people who are most connected to places. This comment that we must double to reach net zero, why? I personally have lived in a part of California that is off of the power grid. I've lived off a fraction of the power that I use when I'm in cities. We do not need as much power as we tell ourselves we need. So if we conserve in and of itself and share properly, those of us who use way too much and those who use next to nothing, we have enough without destroying more of the world's last precious rivers. And finally, as long as we're going down this path of letting dam builders and existing dams sell carbon credits, they're letting someone else avoid emission reductions elsewhere. So if a dam in Chile sells credits to Europe, then European country, instead of reducing emissions, they can pay for these credits and then tell the United Nations, hey, we reduced our emissions. So this counterfeit carbon trading process is going to allow dams to basically increase fossil fuel emissions elsewhere. For the movement, I think understanding this better could help. In a lot of cases, I say we pretend that more information is what we're missing when really we need more people pointed in the right direction. In this case, I really do think we need more information. We need the movements of people who love rivers and the movements of people who want to properly account for emissions to understand the facts on the ground. And I think if we truly understand this and understand the concept of additionality and why counterfeit carbon credits have prevented us from solving the global climate crisis, I think that will help the movement. So thank you, and I'll pass it to Mark.
All right, so I'll try to address this good dam versus bad dam question first. The United States is the only country in the world right now that's currently reporting any of the emissions associated with reservoirs. And it's only surface emissions. they have an estimate associated with turbine emissions, but there's significantly more work that needs to be done there. No other countries in the world are doing this. And study after study, as they come out, shows that the emissions are significant and they're being underreported. So at the very least, we need to make sure that we don't add to the global climate change problem by continuing to build these dams and these hydropower systems that are just going to make the problem worse. As far as existing dams, well, the analysis would need to be done, and certainly it certainly needs to be done in order to identify where the biggest problems are and prioritize those for removal. I just don't think the world and our climate can sustain any more emissions, and we need to do everything we can to reduce the emissions from systems that are already in place. Regarding the question about GRES, this is something that we've examined, and the AllRes tool is functionally intended to be a counterpoint to the GRES tool. The GRES tool only examines a fraction of the source categories. It's not a full life cycle emissions tool, and so it does undercount. It doesn't account for all the different emission sources associated with hydropower systems and reservoir systems. And it also uses models that have been shown to significantly undercount the emissions from surfaces and from turbines. And so that's a significant problem there that needs to be addressed. The GRES tool is primarily funded by the International Hydropower Association and other hydropower interests. There are other funding sources involved as well. And I think there needs to be a move towards tools and modeling platforms that are independent, that are not functionally tied to the development interests of the systems that those development interests are wanting to fund and work with. Regarding the technical question about methane transformation, we're using the global warming potentials published by the IPCC and AR6. As far as methane transformation goes, I think what you're talking about is the opportunity to potentially capture methane in these systems and transform it into, as a raw material, into other potentially useful molecules, or to actually burn it to generate electricity. That is being discussed conceptually within the scientific and engineering literature, but at this point, it's really only conceptual. There have been no significant demonstrations that I've seen in the literature, and certainly nothing to scale. And in the literature, what I've seen discussed is that it's years to decades out, and we don't have years to decades to deal with this problem right now. We are in the midst of a climate crisis. The world is burning up, and we need to be looking at simpler solutions as opposed to engineering solutions to address what is functionally an engineering problem in an over-engineered world.
All our panelists for this. I just want to make a few closing remarks. We've seen through our discussions and research in general that the economics is just not in favor of large hydropower either, and the price of electricity is no longer competitive compared to other kind of sources of energy. Where we've learned from our panelists about the emissions being comparable to other fossil fuel sources of energy. And I hope that we will be removing more dams than building additional projects. We've got over 10,000 old dams that will soon kind of be unviable. We will be doing patchwork on old kind of concrete. But at the same time, we will take inspiration from the Klamath and the move to remove the dams from the Klamath River. The world is watching. I'm sure there are countries looking for inspiration from there. It's a momentous occasion next year to have the Klamath River flow freely. We also have leaders like Mayalmit and Emmanuel here and movements around the world that are working to protect their rivers, and we want to end on a more positive note to say that we don't need any more new hydropower, and we have alternatives, they exist, and let's work towards getting those in place. So thank you all for being here. I'd like to also thank our tech team for all the work they put in to get us up and running. Thank you all for coming. Thank you again to our panelists. Thank you.